start the recording.
Hey everybody, welcome to this afternoon's webinar. We're going to start in about 5 minutes time because colleagues are still arriving. So if you've not yet grabbed a coffee or a cup of tea or a glass of water or something else stronger, then now's the time to do it, and we'll start at 3:05.
So yeah, I'll put you back on.
Okay. Hey, good afternoon again, everybody. Thank you for coming to this afternoon's webinar on approaching British cultural values in ESOL teaching and assessment. Let me introduce myself to start off with. My name is Neil Rockman, and I'm Principal Moderator for ESOL Skills for Life for OCN London, and also Chief Examiner for ESOL International. And I've got with me in the room today Amajit Danjal, who's Head of Learning Partnerships and engagement. He's going to be providing tech support and hopefully and also monitoring the chat, which we'd like you to use this afternoon. So I don't know if anyone's put anything in the chat yet to test it out.
It looks like not.
Okay. So can we check whether this is working? And if you could just put in your name and the learning institution you're from.
So I don't know if they can hear me. Tell me to use the Q&A.
Use the Q&A, not the chat.
Yeah.
Okay. And that would help us to see whether this function's working this afternoon, because we're using a town hall format, which is slightly different from the format we usually use, because this is going to be a larger group, I think, as the afternoon goes on.
Yeah. So the Q&A seems to be working.
Brilliant.
Something from Said.
Yeah. Fantastic. Okay, good. All right, so just a bit of housekeeping. The session is being recorded. I don't think anybody's cameras are on, so you won't be seen, but I think the chat may appear in the recording. So just be aware of that. We intend to finish at 4:30. Hopefully that's the time that you expect. And got a presentation that I want to work through, which will take an hour, maybe slightly over an hour to work through. Which will take us through, obviously, the topic of the session. If you have thoughts and questions as I'm going along, do use the Q&A to put them in. If they're particularly pertinent to whatever I'm saying at that moment, then Amajit will raise those with me and we can deal with them then. Otherwise, I hope we'll get some time at the end of the session for you to ask some questions at that point. Okay, so I hope everything's all right there. I hope you're happy with that. This is the first of a number of sessions that we're hoping to put together on ESOL, on different themes in ESOL. So, you know, what would also be useful to know at the end of the session is what you would be interested in us talking about in terms of ESOL in the next academic year, which is what we hope to run these over. Okay. But let me launch into today. So approaching British cultural values in ESOL teaching and assessment. So there are a number of different threads that I want to draw together this afternoon. But if we go on to the next slide, then you can see the aims of the session. So what I want to do is explore the concept of British cultural values, the eagle-eyed, or maybe I should say the owl-eyed, with our current logo. Amongst you will have seen that we're using a slightly different term for British values than you might have seen either from the Department for Education or from Ofsted. And that's quite deliberate, and I will explain more about that, and that's why I want to explore the concept of this. Then we'll go on to look at why explicitly we should be covering these, or why it's useful rather to cover these in ESOL. And in a way, I don't want to teach any of you to suck eggs. I suspect you already are covering these, but perhaps one of the most useful things that you're going to get from this afternoon's session is how to make it explicit that you're doing that, and how perhaps to add another layer to what you're already doing. So I don't think a lot of what I'm going to be saying in terms of practical ideas this afternoon will particularly surprise you, but what I do hope is it will make concrete things that you're already doing. And provide a useful focus, therefore, for you as you go on with this. So that's the third bullet point, really, to investigate how British cultural values are already a part of ESOL teaching. Personally, I don't see how you can teach ESOL without teaching British cultural values, and hopefully you'll understand that later. You probably are already, a lot of you, if not all of you, on stream with that anyway. Then I want to present some practical ideas. I don't think these will surprise you, but again, just to focus your thinking. And finally, how they are part of our ESOL assessments and how, therefore, aiming towards our ESOL assessments can naturally cause you to embed British cultural values as a part of your teaching. So let's dive in. So why British cultural values? So culture, if we look at the definition of culture, there are a number of different definitions we could pursue, but basically culture surrounds us. It's the environment within which we operate. And looking up a number of definitions of culture, you find that these key words recur again and again. So the first word is behaviours. How does a population behave? It's quite a general word, obviously, in many ways, but also I think you can, if you start thinking about it, and think particularly about the comparison between people who've grown up in Britain and the behaviours that they've learnt, with perhaps a comparison with our partners overseas, literally over the channel, and think about how French people might behave differently. You can see that there's a culture that emerges there in terms of the way British people behave. Underpinning that, it's quite a loaded word, but it's a word that we all adhere to in one way or another. What beliefs are there behind the way that we behave? To take a simple example, we have, and some of you will have seen this, it often appears in ESOL and EFL books. The classic example is someone covered in bandages on two crutches walking down a street, and an acquaintance of theirs says, "Oh, hi, how are you?" And the person replies, "Fine." There's a belief that underpins that. Maybe it's being challenged, and of course, beliefs are challengeable and change over time. But there's still a great cultural expectation that we don't actually tell someone we don't know very well how terrible we're feeling. Okay, so that's where beliefs fit in. I'm not talking just about faith there. Okay, the next word, characteristics, is a word that often occurs when you look at the definition of culture. What does it look like? And what is it about British culture that we adhere to? You know, for example, where is the place of the monarchy in all of that? We all think about it, whatever our opinions of it are. So it's part of our cultural characteristic that we naturally do. Other countries don't think about monarchy at all. So there's quite a difference between the two. And I hope, it might sound a little bit like I'm stating the obvious, but I hope what I'm doing by going through this is showing you things that we don't think about that are always there at the back of our mind in some form or another. And the final word is, for me, almost the most important word for us this afternoon, which is shared. Culture, most definitions talk about a shared understanding. And I think sometimes the way in which we approach British values, which in itself I find quite a loaded term for lots of different reasons, which we don't really have time to unpack this afternoon, but I'm sure you can guess at what those might be. When we unpack British values, we often kind of impose them from on high. We say, okay, so you're an ESOL learner, you've come to this country, here are our values. What we don't fully acknowledge in that process is that those values, as I've already hinted at, will change over time because the makeup of this nation will change over time. And there is a sharing with those who are recent arrivals, maybe arrivals of a second generation, will basically require us to change some of our behaviours, our beliefs, and our characteristics. If I say Windrush, then I'm sure you get the point. Things have changed pre and post Windrush as they should have done. We now have a different and shared understanding of cultural values than we would have had perhaps in the late 40s. And that's not a very long time. I think there are more obvious examples, but I mean, that's what I'm just putting in front of you. There are many that you could pick on. So when we're talking about British cultural values with ESOL learners, I really want to encourage this afternoon that we think about the fact that as soon as someone steps foot into this country, however that might be, they are part of British culture, even if certain members of our population don't want them here. They're still here, and therefore they are part of shaping our culture. And I think that's a really important part of how we approach cultural values when we teach them in ESOL. So negotiation is absolutely key for the cultural values. We can't just state from on high, these are our values and that's it. We need to, with our learners in the classroom, be negotiating what their values look like. And if we just click on in the slide, a couple of points. What does negotiation require? Well, we need to have language to be able to negotiate in whatever form that might be. And that, if you just click on to the next point, thank you. That basically is where ESOL obviously comes in, and hopefully you can see the thread of thinking there when we talk about British cultural values. So if we go on to the next slide, these are currently, and have been since 2014, the values that we are required to teach in all levels of education. And the operative word with these values is teach, which in itself is an interesting idea. So we have these British values in education, these 4 bullet points, which are democracy, rule of law, individual liberty, mutual respect, and tolerance. And this is what our learners are required to learn in the classroom, both explicitly in terms of content. So, for example, in FE colleges, learners are expected to be taught about local democracy, about how Parliament operates, about the monarchy, and therefore what democracy looks like in general across the UK. Of course, there's also the different assemblies that they should learn something about. The rule of law, again, explicitly, learners are expected to know something about laws that are particularly pertinent to them. And then we have these huge concepts, individual liberty, mutual respect, and tolerance, which again, the word teach is attached to. For me, that's a challenge. How do you teach those ideas? I can understand the content of the others, but in a sense, we're now no longer talking about content. We're talking about something completely different. But that's what the government expects us to cover. And if we then go on to Ofsted, and all of you will be graded against this, I've given you here the grade descriptor for behaviours and attitudes, which is the one that's most pertinent to this particular part of the curriculum. And this is what outstanding looks like in Ofsted terms. This is what you will be required to demonstrate to achieve outstanding in behaviours and attitudes, which is a very significant part of your inspection. Learners have consistently high levels of respect for others. They play a highly positive role in creating an environment that values and nurtures difference. Bullying and harassment are never tolerated. So if you match that, and if we just can flick back to the previous slide, I don't know if that's possible to do. So you've got that matrix of 4 values, and then you've got to put that against a statement from Ofsted. If we flick forward again, in terms of that's how behaviour is expected to be demonstrated in an outstanding institution. Some of it, of course, cross-matches quite simply. There's a lot about tolerance, particularly in the behaviours and attitudes descriptor, where democracy comes in and the rule of law is questionable, but you are still required to cover them. Okay, I hope this is making sense so far, because these are the challenges that we're all required to deal with in our learning institutions. Okay, let's go on to the ESOL learner with those at the back of our minds. So, the relevance to the ESOL learner. Every day, whatever an ESOL learner does, they are surrounded by the values of British culture. There isn't, I can't really think of an instance where as soon as someone becomes active in a day, there aren't values of the British culture and they're already having an impact on their life. As soon as they turn the radio on or the television or click onto the internet and anything that is to do with the UK, those values are going to start to be evident. They've only got to step out of their front door and you see the values in the environment around them, whether they encounter another person or not. But as soon as they encounter another person, of course, those values are going to become even more evident. And we all know from our many irritations. I travelled down on the tube here today to do this presentation, and I'm just trying to think how many times I got irritated on the way down. I got irritated by the person who had no awareness that I was anywhere near them because they were looking at their mobile phone all the time, and therefore was getting in my way. Well, I'd argue that that's a behaviour underpinned by a value. I expect other people to notice me. I expect to be considered as part of my environment. Um, I got irritated by the person who banged into me with their bag as they went up the escalator, and I was standing to the right because they'd invaded my personal space. Again, there's a behaviour and a value that's causing a problem. ESOL learners from whatever country may not understand either of those particular behaviours being a problem whatsoever. And conversely, may have other behaviours in their own culture that we don't observe, that they think it's terrible that we don't observe. And the example I'm thinking of is when my son was 3 years old, we travelled to Italy, and very quickly became aware that wherever we went with him, everyone was on the lookout for him in terms of keeping him safe. And after 2 weeks in Italy, we started to find that we were becoming almost overconfident that strangers would look out for our child, and a bit blasé about it. So to then, even after just 2 weeks in Italy, northern Italy, I should say, coming back to the UK was, dare I say it, a culture shock. Because suddenly no one was going to be looking after our son apart from us. It was our responsibility and only that. So, you can see how for some learners, our way of behaving and the values that underpin that, and the values of, if you think of that example, the values that the son is the family's responsibility and no one else's, and the very individualistic culture that we have in this country to a large extent, is something that they might find quite difficult to cope with. And I'm sure that you've got stories from learners yourselves where they've struggled with that and not understood it. So that's part of our cultural values. So if we just click onto these 3 bullet points, you can just bring them all up at the same time, might as well. So where do we encounter these values? I've just given you 3 examples. In the governance of their lives, and what I mean by governance is I'm trying to use that in the most general term possible. What are the parts of their life that they encounter every day which tell them from on high, through some form of authority, this is how you behave? So in the example I've just given, there's governance of London transport. I'm expected to behave in a certain way when I'm using London transport. I'm expected to behave in a certain way when I'm driving my car. Some of those, of course, come into the rule of law. Some of them are more customary values that everybody tries to adhere, well, not everybody tries to adhere to, but we expect people to adhere to, and we get annoyed when they don't. And of course, in your learning institutions, and I wonder how often you think about this, you have governance over learners. There are things you expect them to do, sometimes perhaps without even making them that explicit. And maybe they, because learners are astute, they pick them up from other learners. You expect them perhaps to come into the classroom in a certain way. Let's go a bit further back from that. What's the first thing they have to do when they come to your learning institution? Do they have to show their ID card? Do they have to prove that they're a learner there? That can be problematic for lots of reasons. Not saying it shouldn't be done, but it's something to unpack with learners. Are they expected to greet people at the front desk? The security, if you have security. From there, then, how do they come into the classroom? And what's your expectation of them as they come into the classroom? Do you expect them to come in quietly? Do you expect them to be chatting? How do you expect the class to start? How do you expect it to end? All of those things are part of the governance. And if they're learning online, how's that managed? Because again, you'll be governing their learning when doing that. So that kind of goes into that second point, the culture of their learning. But then it also, in that, becomes even more amorphous for your learners, because how are they to interact with other learners? For example, many years ago, 2 years ago, I taught in a college in the northwest of London where we had a lot of Somali learners. And often in our classrooms, we would have learners who were from both sides of the conflict that was currently going on in Somalia. How did we expect those learners to interact with each other? That was, it's a very direct example, and it was something obviously we needed to explicitly unpack with a number of learners. But often we only unpacked it in reaction to something that had happened in the classroom, rather than stating this is the culture of the classroom from the beginning. And then this may be a slightly trite example, but the post office queue. I've put that because I think it's something we all experience. And when I put this webinar together, I've been in a post office queue that morning, and I was just thinking in my head about all the behaviours that we have and all the values that we have around a post office queue, and how many, and there are countless examples of this, how many moments of potential flashpoint there are in a post office queue, particularly when it's quite long and you're there for 20 minutes, which is often the case in my local post office in Finsbury Park. It's often packed. And that, of course, creates irritation. And that, of course, brings to the fore values, expectations, and behaviours. And we have a very British culture around post office queues that I've never experienced in any other country in the world, to be honest. It's very specific. But I wonder, do we ever explore that with our learners in the classroom? Some of you may well do. And there's lots of fun to be had around that. And even going a little bit further with that, I think my post office queue in Finsbury Park would not be the same. Well, I know it isn't the same as a post office queue in Great Torrington in Devon, which is a place I often visit. There are completely different cultural expectations of how I behave in a post office queue in both those locations. One very simple example, do you talk to people around you or not? I never talk to people around me in Finsbury Park post office queue. If I did that in Great Torrington, I would be seen as completely rude and looked down on, basically, for as long as I was there. I have to talk to people in the post office queue there. Okay, I hope this is starting to get your brains going and thinking not just about these examples, but other things. Okay, let's go on. So let's get specific. And I want to go back to the word that I said I think is the most important in terms of thinking about British cultural values, which is shared cultural values. Your classroom is a place where you have an opportunity to create a culture with values and behaviours and so on, which will then encourage negotiation between and amongst your learners. So, for example, there's a series of questions here that we can think about in relation to this. Who's in charge of the classroom? That sounds like an obvious question. But is that always the same person? And can that at moments change? Can there be a point at which a learner or a group of learners are in charge of the classroom? If that's going to be the case, then how does that happen? Or, as I put here, what does that actually mean? What does it mean to be in charge? Does it mean that you can tell everybody to be quiet when you want them to? Does it mean that you can set the homework and no one else can? Does it mean that you decide what the next bit of learning is or not? So all of those raise massive questions, and all of those are potentials for negotiation. I don't know if you ever think about this, but what's on the walls of your classroom? Who decided what's on the walls of your classroom? Is it about your personal interests or the learner's personal interests? Is it about the language that you've decided is the most important or that they've decided is the most important, and so on? How much can the learners talk? Are they allowed? Some learners don't think they're allowed to talk at all. They think that they should just listen to the teacher. It's a kind of a lecture format because that's their educational experience. Maybe because they've been in classrooms with lots of other learners, and that was really the only way to ensure that things were managed properly. So have you assumed that they know that they can talk? And if they can talk, who can they talk to and when can they talk to them? And I think evening classes present a particular issue. Well, I always found this because people have often been at work or have been at home looking after children or carrying out domestic tasks and are just delighted to be out with other people and just want to chat. And I remember one particular class at the same college that I mentioned earlier, um, where I had a group of learners who were a similar age, same gender, not exactly the same country, but countries from the same region, who just delighted in the fact that they were together for the evening and just wanted to chat. And I fought for weeks, literally weeks, a losing battle where I was trying to get them to concentrate on what I was talking about and stop chatting to each other. And in the end, I realized this was going nowhere and there was no way I would win this battle. And all it was doing was creating irritation for the rest of the class because they constantly, I was constantly saying, please, can you focus on this or something like that? And the rest of the class were kind of almost turning on this group as a result. So we negotiated what was reasonable in terms of chatting. And basically, between us, came up with the idea that there should be moments of chat within the lesson. And it was up to me. They agreed it was up to me to manage them. That's what they wanted to because otherwise they felt it'd be too chaotic. But I had to give them a chance to chat. And of course, I'm sure you all realize their learning improved massively. Concepts were learned more quickly, attention was more focused, and the class became much more enjoyable, partly also because I stopped being irritated and I was enjoying teaching a class. So that made a difference to the whole atmosphere. So who can they talk to and when? That's a cultural value. If my cultural value had said you never talk in the classroom to a fellow learner, or you don't have the opportunity for chat is not part of what we do, then obviously it would have been a completely different outcome. And I'm not saying my way was the only way, but it's something that's open to negotiation. How do learners relate to the teacher? That's quite a key one for me as well. Because my learners were all adults. On the whole, I did teach some 16 to 19-year-olds, but largely it was all adults. I always wanted them to call me by their first name. And I'm sure that some of you have had this experience where what happened, and I think you can probably guess what I'm going to say, is that instead of calling me Neil, they called me Mr. Neil, or sometimes, which I quite like, Sir Neil. Um, so, and they didn't want to let go of that. And in a sense, I had imposed, again, my cultural value onto them, and they weren't comfortable with it. It wasn't that they didn't know the language, which is what I thought at first. It was just that they couldn't do it because it didn't fit with their culture. And they're now part of the British culture. So why should I just impose mine upon them and say, this is the way we do things in Britain? It might have been the way we did things before, but does it have to be now? And again, how do learners relate to fellow learners? That kind of um, relates to what I've just said about the learners from Somalia, for example. I just wonder for a moment, just to get a little bit of interaction from you guys, because you've listened to me for a few minutes now. What other questions do you think we could have in terms of classrooms' cultural values that could be negotiated to create that British, uniquely to your classroom, uniquely British cultural values for your classroom? What other questions might you add in that I haven't covered there? Amateur, you can read any out. There's some good ones.
Yeah, I'm working for
Okay.
see if anything comes through.
Mhm. Sorry, I have sprung that on you, so you might not be ready to type anything. I'm just going to give a moment, see if you do.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Maybe I'll leave that for a little bit later, and when we've talked a bit more, you might come up with some questions by then. Okay, let's move on then. Let's go to the next slide. So beyond your classroom, what are the values of your learning institution? So again, if we click down this slide, most of you, well, I don't know, maybe not most of you, but quite a lot of you will be in institutions where ESOL isn't the only thing that happens. And even if it is, your class obviously won't be the only class that happens in that institution. So going back to what I was saying a little bit earlier, there will be expectations, and these perhaps are less negotiable than the classroom. The classroom, in a way, is a lovely kind of safe microcosm, a bubble within which learners can operate. And you've got that freedom to negotiate and create that warm atmosphere where learning can really happen. Your learning institution won't be obviously be the same as that, because there are many other users of it, not just the students, but also your colleagues and any other staff, security and so on, that you may have. So in a sense, there's a different kind of negotiation and a different kind of learning opportunity that can happen here in a fairly safe environment, which enables a learner to also start to understand the cultural values beyond the walls of your learning institution. So again, I've come up with some questions here that might be of interest, the things that they think about.
Before we move on to the, I'll bring up a few.
Yeah, do. Yeah.
I don't know if people are going to hear me, so I'll just
I'll say them as you soon.
I mean, it's kind of classroom management.
Yes.
So about how learners choosing who they sit with.
Oh, wow.
Choose who they sit with.
Brilliant. I hadn't thought of that. Yes. So the classroom plan, where do you seat learners in the classroom? Do they get to choose, or do you tell them this is where they sit? Do they get to choose because it's their friends or because it's a person who's at a different level to them? Wow, that's a really good one. Brilliant. Okay.
I mean, related to that as well, there was a point about gender differences.
Yes.
So men with men, men with women.
Yes.
Potential cultural or related issues that might come up.
Yes, and so that was all about gender differences and cultural values might come up. Just on that, I remember a very, very awkward period of time that I had, which I tried to ignore and hoped would go away and didn't, so I had to deal with it explicitly, where I had a lovely older gentleman from Iraq who saw himself as an elder and a mentor, and saw himself particularly as an elder or mentor to any young women who were from the same region as him. So often would want to sit with them. And I don't think there was anything more than what I've just stated about his intentions, but you can imagine how that might have made some of them feel, particularly those who had left Iraq because of some of the religious expectations placed upon women, which he quite happily adhered to. So that caused great tension. And in the end, we had to negotiate in that small group how that was going to be managed. It wasn't easy. I'm not going to tell the whole story because it wasn't easy by any means. But if I'd headed it off a little bit earlier, perhaps, and as a class we'd created an expectation, then that might have been much easier. Okay, and I'm sure you can see, sorry, I know you've got another one there, haven't you? But I'm sure you can see how that fits with tolerance and individual liberty in terms of the values that we were looking at earlier. Okay, next one.
Just a couple more. One of them was about topics and
yes.
Is there anything off limits?
Very good. Absolutely. Yes. Is anything off limits? That's a really good question.
Yeah. The last one was about or appropriacy things in the classroom. So it's kind of related.
Okay, you've now spun me into a surreal world where I'm imagining Jacob Rees-Mogg teaching ESOL. What etiquette might be involved in that experience. I think the negotiations would be really interesting. Okay, really good. That's exactly what I'm getting at. I think you're absolutely getting what I'm talking about. Okay, so let's go to the institution. So some questions here. Who do they greet and how? Is the expectation, and it's a subtle expectation, it really is. I wonder if I can unpack this a little bit. The expectation of greeting as they come into the institution. I've been to so many different colleges in my time. Some colleges, it's very kind of, you've got this open, it's often an open plan reception area, and nothing is expected of the learner except that they've got their ID visible. And they go through the barrier and everything happens smoothly, and there is no interaction whatsoever with the security staff, the front desk staff. In other institutions, and it isn't related just to size, I've seen this in the biggest institutions, the absolute expectation is that they greet in a friendly manner the security staff and they say good morning to them. And it's not necessarily a heavy thing. I'm thinking of one particular college which will remain nameless, but the security staff there was so kind of ebullient and full of life that if a learner didn't say hello to them in the morning, they were challenged, you know. Now I can imagine for someone who's just at the beginning stages of learning English as a second language, they'd really worry about what they had done wrong there if they didn't greet in that way. You can understand how there's a nice friendly way to start a day, but it might not be friendly for everybody. And particularly as in that institution, the security staff are in uniform. Again, I'm sure you can imagine how that might be problematic. So that may not be something you can negotiate, but it's a value of your institution potentially that needs unpacking in the classroom. And then that links as well. But there, what information should they provide and why? Even the mere expectation, which almost every learning institution in the country now has, and has really cracked in the last 10, 15 years, is you have ID. You've got to have an identity card. Again, problematic potentially for some learners, but it is a cultural expectation that we have. No, I won't say that. I'll move on. And what information don't you give? What do you not say? What is too much? Where do you stop? Where's the line? Where are you telling the security guard too much about your personal life? Or asking them for help in an inappropriate way, which can also often happen. I've seen it a few times. Okay, who's on their side? Who's there to help them? Is it just support services in college, or is there elsewhere that they can go? And that kind of then links to the questions I've got unpacked below. And I'm sure that many, many, many of you, again, if not all of you, have encountered, I think we often do as ESOL teachers, encountered a learner who had unrealistic expectations of what we can achieve for them in terms of, and this impinges on the rule of law. What can we as a teacher do in terms of supporting a learner with housing problems, with problems in terms of getting their children over from their own country, with problems in terms of finding a job or applying for a job? How much can we do? Even things like getting a passport. Getting a passport is so complicated in this country. And there are so many slips and steps that you have to take there, even filling in as a witness, as a referee passport form. I'm sure some of you've done it, is culturally very specific. And that needs quite a lot of unpacking because often a learner can expect far too much from you. And much as I said, I've kind of emphasized, as I'm sure you understand, the learner so far in terms of negotiation. You are the other side of the negotiation and you are allowed to limit expectations in a realistic way. So as an example of unrealistic expectations, I thought I'd show you this clip from Big Big Train. Sorry, not Big Big Train, that's a prog band. Big Train, which is from quite a few years ago with a very young Simon Pegg.
there's no sound.
Okay. All right. We've just realised there was no sound on that, which makes it not useful at all. We might need to share sound. I don't know if there's a way of doing that on town.
Yeah, there might. Well, I get that sort of.
Okay, we'll carry on and see.
Yeah, scenario.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, and we'll see if we can do it. There is another video a bit later, so we'll see if we can get it sorted by then. But hopefully you got the idea that basically she was asking, do you speak English? And they were saying in perfectly good English, no, we don't. And it extrapolated from there. Okay, sorry about that technical malfunction. Let's move on to the next slide.
Yes.
So now I've talked in quite general terms about negotiating cultural values in the classroom. That could be done in any classroom. Yes, I've been specific in terms of the particular experiences of an ESOL learner, but I haven't really tied it down to the subject of ESOL. So that's what I want to do on this slide and think about the language of negotiation, and think of this in terms of the stages of negotiation, which you should really work through when you're negotiating anything. So the first stage is the signaling stage. And so this is the point at which you might, your learner might say, can you help me? But does it have to be your learner? Couldn't it be you? You could approach a learner or your class and say, can you help me, to indicate that there is something that you need to talk about. We've put there in brackets OCN London ESOL speaking assessments, not just to simply advertise our assessments, although there's nothing wrong with doing that, but also to point out something I found very interesting in our speaking assessments is one of the things that we require, and it's a specific assessment criteria, is that learners know how to politely gain attention, and can do that, demonstrate the language they can do that. And what I found very interesting is over the last 2 or 3 years, is if any assessment criteria gets missed, it's that one. That the next bit of the role play is launched into, which is, asking about getting a job or asking for help in a public transport situation. But often, no, not often, most of all the things that's missed, I'll just put it that way, most frequently this is the one that's missed. So, and I'm not quite sure why. It might be that people are just rushing on into what they see as the most important part of the assessment. To me, was quite indicative, and it's one of the things that started to get me to think about putting this topic together in the first place, to be honest. Because I was thinking, why are we missing that? What's going on in our thinking that suggests that we don't need to assess or teach or cover that in any sense at all? And in some ways, I think we kind of expect people just to be able to do that. But just think for a moment about how easy it is to get that wrong. How many subtleties are we negotiating in terms of our cultural values when we ask for help from someone who we don't know? What are the appropriate ways in which to do that? My father-in-law always used to say, bless him, you can never offend someone by being too polite. And I've kind of taken that as a motif in some ways in this kind of situation. So I'm much more happy to be over polite and over formal, perhaps, when asking for help in any situation, than to go the other way and to say, oi, you, which is not an unheard of way of asking for help. So I think that in itself is a stage that we should not be overlooking when we're looking at the language and the negotiation, because it is a genuine question. Or is it? No, sorry, that's not fair. Is it a genuine question? Is the expectation when you say to someone, can you help me, that they might say no? Almost certainly not. But it's a question, and grammatically it looks the same as any other question that has alternative answers there. So that's the first stage. Okay, if we click on to the next one. Building rapport. How are you? Did you have a good journey? We don't launch straight into the subject. When I first trained as an ESOL teacher, and I didn't search this out because I think it would be very cringeworthy now, but this was the beginning of the 90s, so you can start to age me now. Um, I One of the things we were shown in our training was a video of two people going into a bank and asking for help with their bank account. One was a native British speaker, and the other was a speaker who was originally from India and a recent arrival. Both of them basically approached the topic in exactly the same way. There really wasn't very much difference between what they said. But the big difference, sorry, what I should say is they were filmed secretly, and the people who they were asking were people who didn't know before it was filmed that these were actors basically, and that this was being filmed as a kind of experiment. So both of them had the same thing that they needed sorting out. I think it was transferring money from one bank account to another. But what the British speaker did that the Indian speaker didn't do, Hindi speaker, I should say, didn't do, is he built rapport with the bank teller first. He said a couple of things about the weather, and whether it was going to change. And I think there was something about a difficult journey or something like that to get to the bank. Remember, this is 30 years ago. Maybe our cultural expectations of banks are completely different now. I think they probably are, but just go with me on this. Whereas the Hindi speaker did none of that. His focus was entirely on what he needed to achieve, and entirely reasonably, he needed to emphasize to the bank teller how important it was that he got achieved what he needed to have achieved. And afterwards, of course, they were interviewed, and this was done in more than one bank. And every single one of the bank tellers spoke immediately about how rude the Hindi speaker was and how they didn't like the way they'd been approached. And you could see the irritation building as they were engaged in this exchange with him. Whereas with the native British speaker, there was no irritation at all. It was all very easy. And you know, you can imagine that there were some racist assumptions that may well have come out of that too. But overall, they talked about the fact that he was rude and he wasn't interested in them as a person, and he just wanted to get done this thing about money. Okay, so building rapport may not be something, but then conversely, it might be that something that people overindulge in before they actually get to the point. So it can go both ways, right? Positioning. Oops, sorry. What is it that the person is concerned about? What are they worried about? What are they sure about? What do they want to achieve? That needs to be stated clearly, but the language around that needs to be appropriate. How clearly can they state what their position is? How much must they couch that in polite language? Okay, and I'm sure you can also see the grammatical constructions around all of this too. That we're obviously using particular tenses. We're using the present tense here, but there are all sorts of little mini grammatical moments, if you like, in what's happening here, in the kind of conjunctions of words that you create, and also in the compression of words. I mean, okay, it's not a grammatical point, but you know, you wouldn't say I am worried about, you'd say I'm worried about, because what are you choosing to emphasize? It's not you, it's the worry. Okay, agreeing and disagreeing. How do you do that? Okay, maybe some of our native British speakers who are amongst our leaders at the moment don't understand this and don't necessarily model the best way to do this. But there are cultural expectations in everyday life that we have, which, if language is used effectively, diffuses any difficulty, even if there's disagreement. I particularly like that second phrase. I understand where you're coming from, but just look at that phrase. I understand where you are coming from. That has values, behaviors, expectations behind it. It's about tolerance. It's about the liberty to have a different point of view, which isn't the case in every country around the world. But it also has an incredibly complex, colloquial, if I can put it that way, phraseology, where you are coming from. So it's about a journey. And the expectation is that the journey isn't over behind all of that. So much to unpack just in that phrase, which is all to do with values. Okay. And lastly, concluding, that's really helpful. And of course, that wonderful phrase, let's agree to disagree, which I don't think anybody ever means when they say it, by the way, but we say it because we're trying to pretend we do. I certainly don't usually mean it when I say it. Maybe that's just me. Okay.
I mean, sorry to.
Of course, yes.
This again, but I like that point about I understand where you're coming from, but
yes,
in English we've got quite a flowery way of making sentences a lot longer to be more polite, whereas in some other cultures it's not about. You mentioned Italy.
Yes,
it's very direct.
Absolutely. Yeah, I understand where you're coming from, but yes, it did. You couch it with very flowery terms. And I recently was in Greece for our ESOL International, and I walked. I mean, I was in Athens for all the time, and it's a lovely city, great place, safe place. I found a very safe place to walk around. But there was one moment, I think it was on a Sunday morning, when I had some time to myself, and I was walking down the street, and I heard this most heated argument. It wasn't a discussion, argument going on between two men, and it sounded like they were about to knock 7 bells out of each other. But when I got closer to them, they were smiling, and it wasn't that they were smiling because it was a joke. They were smiling because they were enjoying the discussion, and it was their way. And I popped into a coffee shop across the way to get a coffee, and I just asked the guy who spoke really good English, said, "What are they talking about?" And he said, "Oh, it's what they talk about every Sunday. It's their football teams. They always do this." Now, I mean, I know we do that in Britain, and you can have really heated arguments about Arsenal and Tottenham and so on, but just the expectation of there being a fairly violent disagreement that wasn't a violent disagreement was nothing like what I would expect in this country. So yes, they weren't being flowery at all. Okay, let's go on to a classic scenario, the GP. How many times have you talked about the GP or NHS in the classroom? Now, look at how much here you can put in terms of the cultural values that are associated with them. So, I mean, I don't know that I fully understand this anymore, and I don't know if any of you do, because it seems to have shifted so much, perhaps particularly because of the pandemic. What are the cultural values of a GP? I was told off in the summer because I thought you could ring up for an appointment to book in advance. This is going to ring bells with some of you, I know. And I was told when I rang up that no, you don't do that. You ring on the day that you want an appointment and you have that appointment on the day. That had shifted within the 6 months since I'd had my last appointment, I think. But it was given to me as a fait accompli, as I should have known that. That was entirely the expectations of the GP. And why on earth was I behaving in this stupid manner? To have this unrealistic expectation of booking an appointment in advance. No one had told me. And it's a great GP, by the way. I'm not name them, but I wouldn't put them down because they are fantastic in so many ways. But that wasn't communicated with me. Now that's hard enough for us who've lived in the country all our lives. But for a learner who, this whole idea of the way we do medicine in this country is huge. On earth do they negotiate the shifting values there? And behind what I've just said there is the cultural expectation that GPs do keep changing the boundaries, that the goalposts do keep shifting because the funding keeps shifting, or the targets keep shifting, or something or other keeps shifting. And that links to the next point. What can we expect of a GP? Partly in terms of, what you expect when you go to a GP. I don't know now, and I don't know if any of you do, what I go to a healthcare assistant for, what I go to a nurse for, and what I expect to see a doctor for. I don't know what the difference in their roles are anymore. And, as I get older, there are more things I need to go and see a GP about. but a GP is an all-encompassing term. It is literally what it says, a general practice. But who do I ask for? And again, when I ring reception, there's kind of an expectation that I would know that a nurse does this and a healthcare assistant does that and the GP does that. So if I want to have my cholesterol checked, which by the way I need to, maybe I'm showing too much then. I go to the healthcare assistant who tells me off about the amount of crisps I eat. If I want to, go for blood test, I go to the nurse, etc., etc., etc. You can see where I'm going with this. But then also, what can we negotiate isn't always as fixed as it appears to be. And there is room for maneuver, and there are moments where you can choose to stand your ground and say, no, I don't want that, I want this. But then there are other moments when you can't do that, and it just won't get you anywhere and just will irritate the person on the other end of the phone. Okay. I hope this is ringing bells in terms of your own experience. I'm not saying I hope you've all had a bad experience with a GP, but I hope you understand where I'm coming from with this. And then how do you relate to those different roles within a GP? Now, again, my goodness me, the cultural expectations around this are so complex. My father, until the day he died, treated the GP pretty much like they were God. You didn't question a thing they said. They knew everything. And you just listened and you did exactly what they said, and then you would be fine. That was his generation. It's not my generation's experience of going to a GP, and I certainly don't think it's going to be my children's experience of going to a GP, and theirs is probably different from mine. So it's not just in terms of the national cultural expectation, it's also a generational expectation, and which one is right and which one is wrong. So what does a second language learner who's in their 60s, who may have grown up in their own country with a cultural expectation like my father's, do when they go to a GP? How do we treat them? How might that cause them problems? Where can they negotiate? And again, I go back to the previous slide. There's language around this that you can use. And how should we be spoken to? It's not just about how we treat others, it's how we should expect to be treated. And the whole thing that the NHS is very strong about patient dignity, and certainly in terms of words and often in terms of actions, but sometimes not. And so what do you do when you're not spoken to appropriately? Okay. Going beyond the personal experience, think about the context of this. We have this word appointment. And what are appointments? And how fixed are they, and what are the penalties if you don't turn up for an appointment on time? And what are the cultural expectations about time in our country that are perhaps different from our language learners' expectations in their country? Okay, so for example, in the summer, I was late for a GP appointment due to a misunderstanding, genuine misunderstanding. And I was sent a warning text that if I continue to be late for my appointments, they may choose to strike me off their list. But if, and obviously then that was something we negotiated. Second language learner who didn't think that that would ever be an issue, what on earth would they do with that? Okay, how do you complain? And then going even further than that, if we go right to the end of the slide, because I'm aware time is ticking on and I need to give space for questions too. There's all this stuff about institutions. We talked about democracy. Obviously, the NHS came about because of a democratic decision. There's a great opportunity here for lots of reading and learning about the NHS and its foundation, and also thinking forward. We're going to have an election in the next year, so the NHS will inevitably be part of the discussions in that election. It's bound to be. So there'll be a lot of talk about its future, and your learners are part of that. So what do you think about the future of the NHS? What do they think it should do? And so on and so on. I'm sure you can follow on from that. Okay, let's carry on to the next slide. Back to the post office queue. I think I've covered a lot of this as well, or so far. I could talk for hours about this, but I find number 3 down there. Can you talk on your phone in the queue? In Finsbury Park, absolutely. In fact, that's really pretty much what everybody else does, partly perhaps because And I say everybody else because I've never yet crossed that line myself, and maybe I should. And loudly as well. It's fine to be loud. But go to my example in Great Torrington. If I dared to do that, oh my goodness me, I would be the talk of the village post office for the next year, I should think, at least. How do you express frustration? You know, we're tutting. Tutting is such a British thing. Have you ever taught your learners to tut? I did. We had a great half an hour learning to tut, and to do it in a way that doesn't get too big, and just is acceptable and involves the others around you in agreement rather than disagreement. You know, what do you do when someone jumps the queue? Do you challenge it or not? And if so, if you are going to challenge it, how do you challenge it? There are so many expectations, and that goes into those next two questions. And again, I've given you some examples of questions there about the post office and some content you could pursue there. My goodness me, it would be interesting to look at the whole post office scandal with the appalling thing that the post office mistresses and masters were put through when the computer system said that they were doing naughty things. That would be a very interesting piece of learning. Have we got the sound working?
I think we can unshare and reshare.
Okay, so we're just going to do this because you need to hear Joe Lycett.
Just think if I do this, include computer sound.
That looks right.
Yeah. Sorry, just going to bring us back down here. And
Claire thinks if somebody's difficult with you,
Can we just pause and check
awkward,
people can
making
hear?
your life hard for any reason, shouldn't try and rationalize with them, shouldn't try and speak to them on their level. You should try and out-weird them. Which came in very usefully for me recently in my local post office. There's a woman there, she's been there about 20 years. I don't like her. She's smug, is the word. One of those faces that's so smug it sort of folds into itself. Do you know what I mean? Like, she looks like someone's punched a quiche. And she's called Lorraine. No, you're better than that. And she's always got some quip, some line. I went in with my passport form, and they do a check and send service at the post office, and she licked her finger and she went through it. And she went, your referee has spelt neighbour wrong. And I went, what? She's like, he's missed out the H on neighbour. You'll have to fill it in again. I was like, surely that's all right. And she went, no, there can be no risk of any confusion as to what that word means. You'll have to fill it in again. Pushed it back at me. I thought, I'm not having this. It takes ages to fill out that form. You have to send off for it. You have to get a referee. I thought, I'm not having it. So I thought, I'll be a bit weird with her. So I went, oh, no, sorry. He's not my neighbour. He's my doctor. She went, what? I said, he's misspelled doctor. So doctor's obviously spelled D-O-C-T-O-R. He spelt it N-E-I-G-B-O-U-R. He spelled doctor wrong. And she went, no, that clearly says neighbour. Oh, doesn't! Did quiche face back it? I didn't know.
Always worth having a bit of Joe Lycett. Okay, I'm going to move on. I'm not saying very much about this slide because I'm running out of time and I do want to leave space for you. So I'm going to try and get through these next few slides in no more than 10 minutes. So national treasures is fascinating when we talk about this concept of national treasures. And this is so much part of our British cultural values. What is it about these four people? And this, by the way, I haven't picked these at random. These were all in the top 15 of a recent survey by Heart radio station of who are the national treasures in Britain. And I'm sure there are, you know, you might say, well, I don't know why they are, but I don't think any one of you, dare I say it, I'm going to go out on a limb here. I don't think any one of you would question David Attenborough. I think every single person in this country would say, yes, he's a national treasure. Because he can't do anything wrong. I mean, God forbid he did. But, you know, he is absolutely up there. Now, why? And there's so much richness in terms of what it is that they epitomize, that they reflect back to us in terms of our cultural values that we want to be adhered to, that say to us, this is the best of us. This is the gift of our nation. What is it about them? I mean, I dare to say that I don't think anyone would question Judi Dench either. But really, she's a great actress and she's a lovely person, but there are other great actresses and lovely people. Why does she get up there more than anyone else? And you could spend a number of lessons exploring this with your learners. But in the process of doing so, answering those questions at the top of the page, inevitably you will be talking about what our expectations are of these national treasures. Or sorry, what it is that we expect people to do or be to get to that status. And who is approaching that, and who from their own lives would they want to be there as a national treasure? So then we're getting into negotiation. Okay, now I'm going to give you 3 examples taken from our assessments on the next 3 slides of an assessment that is set by us. If we go on to the next one, so these are all taken from the health and well-being theme. We have 3 different themes that are operating at any one time. Health and well-being has just been withdrawn, so these are now practice papers. And these are examples of an assessment. And because in the OCN London model of ESOL assessment, you as the teacher and assessor are allowed to see the papers in advance of you doing them with the learners, that gives you plenty of opportunity to unpack the cultural values about anything that is in an assessment. So here, for example, we've got, this is a reading task, and you will know that your learners are going to be encountering this. So it's about going to the gym and, about an induction at a gym. And it's about arranging an appointment and so on. And look at the language around it too, the way that it's phrased, and so on. And it's so easy, I'm sure, for you to see there what cultural expectations we have around this kind of invitation, if you're thinking of going to the gym. And so just the language itself lends itself to exploring tolerance, appropriate behavior, and so on. But then beyond that, and I would certainly want to cover these in the classroom, knowing that this topic was coming up, and that this has been raised and perhaps a little earlier with one of the points made in the chat. Who can go to the gym? Okay, do both men and women go to the gym? Do they both go to the same gym? Is there any kind of segregation in the gym? What happens with toilets in the gym and showers in the gym? Loads of things around that, which they may or may not be comfortable with and may or may not know. And what rules therefore are there in the gym? The gym is a very exposing place. I don't know if any of you go to the gym regularly. I don't go regularly, but I do go. And the fact I don't go regularly makes me feel perhaps even more exposed when I am there. I'm not going to lower the camera so you can see my belly, but it could be smaller. I don't like it. Alone, what are the rules about middle-aged men wearing lycra? So loads that can be unpacked there in terms of rules, in inverted commas, which aren't exactly the rule of law, but again, you can see that they impinge upon that. Again, there's a whole thing about appointments. And if they were to reply to this text that you have on the left, how would they reply? What would be the language that they would need to use, particularly at the beginning and the end of the text? And we're not talking about a particularly advanced level of language here. This is entry 2. Yes, there are some difficult pieces of vocabulary in there, but they can be pre-taught, which is why we try and keep our language realistic. So that's why we allow any difficult terms like induction to be pre-taught ahead of doing this test, this assessment. But even so, you would expect an entry 2 learner to be able to begin and close a piece of communication in an appropriate manner. So what are the cultural expectations around that? I used to have learners I worked with from Nigeria and Ghana, whose cultural expectation was you would always ask about the person's family at the beginning of any communication. So you can see, and I'm not saying that's wrong, it isn't wrong, it's a different cultural expectation, but there needs to be something else learnt in its place. Okay, if we go on to the next example, this is taken from a speaking assessment at entry 3. And this is about a fast food restaurant chain opening nearby, and it's to start off a discussion activity. So they're going to discuss and give opinions about what they think about this fast food chain. It's a great task, actually. The discussions I've heard around this have been really good because it does divide people pretty equally. There are learners who love the idea of being able to access fast food really easily, particularly after a long day at work, and they won't have to worry about cooking, and this is just what they want. And other learners who are absolutely terrified of what it's going to do to their kids and their diet and so on. But before you even get into that, the fact that you're even allowed to discuss whether this is right or not, and therefore to have an opinion that you can voice to the council, obviously explicitly requires you in the classroom before you do this task to talk about local democracy and that wonderful and engaging piece of work around planning decisions. How are planning decisions made? Have you ever been to a planning meeting? They're the most tedious meetings you can ever go to, but they do allow us to have a voice. So, that's something we can talk about. How do you protest against local issues in a way that is appropriate? I mean, goodness me, with the weekend just gone, the whole idea of protest in this country, and you see how the cultural values are shifting in the last month around that. And we desperately need to have a big discussion about that in our nation, I think, because we're really running into some brick walls here. And I'm not going to say what my opinions are because that's irrelevant. But we can't just allow knee-jerk reactions to happen as they are, because that's where everything starts to go wrong. And obviously, going back to language from before, I'm sure you don't do this, but I have seen ESOL classrooms where assessors and teachers kind of expect learners to just know how to discuss and don't do any teaching in advance around what discussion looks like. That needs and that goes back to the whole thing about language and negotiation I gave you on a previous slide. So I won't spend any more time on that. Okay, last one. This is level 1 writing. So this is about wanting to use a room in a community centre for health and wellbeing sessions. So a whole load of work you could do here around British cultural values. What are community centres? Who uses them? How are they used? What's appropriate? What's inappropriate? Can they be used for religious functions? Can they be used for prayer? Can they be used for children's parties, and so on and so on and so on? What basically are community centres? And again, I think, well, I know that will change in different parts of the country and in different locations. If any of you teach in more rural locations, I think community centres may well have a greater prominence than they might do in an urban location. I might be wrong on that. That might be a completely wrong assumption. But they will be greatly valued by the community, and your community may well have certain expectations around what is appropriate in them as a result. But again, shared values. What would your learners like the community centre to be used for? That maybe it isn't being used for right now, and that maybe would be a very beneficial thing for your community. And then again, we've got this whole thing about how do you approach someone you don't know when you want to book something like this, and set up something for you to use. Okay, that was fairly fast.
I'm afraid that this type of webinar doesn't allow study related.
Okay, so
writing.
Okay, so 10 minutes now. Don't know if you heard that from Amajit, but we're using a town hall format. Apparently, we can't enable your microphones, so we can't do this through live chat. But if you've got any questions on anything that I've said so far that you'd like to ask, we've got 10 minutes. Type some questions into the Q&A section, and Amajit's going to feed them to me. And if there are common themes, Amajit will see that they're emerging, and we can deal with them. So any thoughts, any questions in response to anything that I've said so far? And I know I've covered a lot in a short space of time.
let them know I'm going to drop the link to ESOL on our webpage. I'll drop that in the discussion.
Okay, so Amajit's just saying he's going to drop the link to ESOL on the OCN London website into the discussion so that you can click onto that and have a look at what we offer in terms of ESOL in your own time.
Question: how is it's a bit of strange. How is it best to deal with punctuality?
Yes. Okay.
I guess because it goes back to the point you're making.
Yeah, about classroom expectations. Okay. Well, there's no simple answer to that. So the question is, how best to deal with punctuality? I think what I would say is you need to go back to expectations. And there are a number of layers of expectations around that. So there's your expectation. What do you expect in terms of punctuality? What does the individual learner expect in terms of punctuality? What do the class expect in terms of punctuality? Because that may not be the same, obviously. And finally, what does your institution expect in terms of punctuality? So if I unpack that, you may always want your learners to be there at the beginning. But if it's an evening class and they've been working or have other responsibilities, that may be very difficult for some learners, understandably. So then there may have to be individual negotiation. I'm always going to be 15 minutes late because I've got to wait till my husband comes back from work before I can leave the children, for example, just off the top of my head. I hope that's not too stereotypical. But it's certainly one I've encountered a number of times. So therefore, my expectation will change. Okay, I can't expect you to be punctual. Therefore, I'm going to have to rejig how the beginning of a lesson works. And I remember that with a particular evening class with at least 3 learners who were in that position. So we always started with individual tasks that any learner could just come in, pick up and get on with. And then we would come together about half an hour into the lesson and in a way formally start at that point. But that may conflict with your institution's expectations that if a learner is consistently late, then they're not going to be able to stay in the class. So there then needs to be negotiation around that and how that works and whether it's possible and so on. So when you say how best to deal with punctuality, for me, it's going back to that word shared, and it's going back to perhaps the idea of realistic. What is shared and what is realistic for your learners? And I do think I made the mistake in my early years of ESOL teaching of being too polite and not wanting to confront issues like this head on, allowing a bit of a lackadaisical, or laissez-faire, maybe that's a better word, approach to coming to the classroom on time, which in turn irritated the whole class because there was someone who was always late. And why were they always late? Why couldn't they manage their time better? What's the matter with them? And because I never explicitly dealt with it, then it stayed a place of irritation. And that learner, to a large extent, was ostracized is too strong a word, but they certainly weren't included in the main group of the class. And I don't know what was going on there because I never asked. Now, if that's happening, I would explicitly sit down with the learner or group of learners and go through the expectations around punctuality and come to a negotiated shared agreement which reflected my values, their values, and the values of the class. I hope that makes sense.
I've got another question from Suizia. Yeah. Are there any differences between men and women when we think about individual liberty in the UK?
Yes. Yes and no. In the rule of law, no. And that's a really interesting teaching point, isn't it? Because equal opportunities legislation states quite explicitly there should be no difference. Women and men should be expected to be treated the same in terms of pay, conditions, and so on. However, I'm sure you can think of many instances where that isn't true. and where women have been sidelined or overlooked or ignored. And it has not been challenged effectively because legislation can't do everything. And I don't want to be too critical, but if there's a mistake with the values that we're required to teach with in further education, that list of 4 that I gave you at the beginning, if there's a mistake with that, it is that they're fixed and achieved. We haven't achieved democracy, we haven't achieved tolerance, etc., etc. We're on a journey towards them. And I'm sure we'll always have to improve. We'll never quite get there. That doesn't mean you stop doing it or trying to get towards it, which is why, again, going back to this whole title of this webinar, British cultural values, I think is a much more useful way of looking at this, because it is about our desire to work towards those things rather than to actually have them right now, because we don't. No, I won't say that. But I think in terms of the whole question of men and women, that's fantastic. And what are you going to do about transgender? Where does that fit into the discussion? Is that an appropriate discussion to have in your ESOL classroom? It should be, because it is certainly something that's discussed regularly in our culture at the moment, and is a very good example of something that we have not yet achieved. And I'm saying this as a father of a transgender daughter. So I know the negotiations and the complexities that are involved in all of this. And I know the uncomfortableness about it as well. And it's a wonderful example of something where we're on a journey, and a very obvious journey. And we, dare I say, all need to calm down a bit and actually learn to negotiate a little bit more effectively around the whole issue. Okay.
I've got nothing else at the moment, Neil. I did just reiterate that if there are any other particular topics.
Yes, please. Yes. Well, we've almost come to the end of our time, so I hope you found that helpful this afternoon, and that it's provoked some thinking. I hope also for those of you who may be facing an Ofsted in the next year, I'm sure there will be some of you, that it helps you to think about, okay, how do we demonstrate that we are actually dealing with the behaviours and the attitudes that Ofsted require of us to achieve an outstanding grade. And if you think about these things in terms of negotiating values, you will be well on the way to getting that higher grade and that statement. Okay, so thank you for your time. I hope that's been beneficial, and have a good rest of the day.
I'm going to leave it on for a couple of seconds as we've got